One of the biggest threats in the 40k universe is the Tyranids, an unending swarm of aliens bent on overwhelming their opposition, stripping planets of life and assimilating their biomass to feed the swarm and continue the cycle. And today, you are going to learn all about them. From the bizarre body horror of Rogue Trader to the commercial success of Space Marine 2, the Tyranids have come a long way. But what was the inspiration behind them? Was it StarCraft? Was it Geiger's Alien? Was it Starship Troopers? Why have they been drawn out of their slumber in the space between galaxies? Is something acting like a lure for them? Or even more horrifyingly, are they simply fleeing from someone greater and more dangerous in the outer void? And finally, what's next for them? What new beasts could the hive mind spawn to unleash upon its prey in future? Let's find out. Ah, the Imperium, the perfectly functioning utopia of the 41st millennium. Wait, what's this in the bottom right-hand corner? This is new. It's probably nothing. Best to ignore it. Back in the 90s, these galaxy maps occasionally made an appearance in some Warhammer 40,000 rulebooks. They would show the locations of all the main planets in the universe and zoom in on key battlegrounds and areas of interest. Now I'm going to cut away and show you the opening credits of Dad's Army. The Tyranids that we will be talking about today are a terrifying proposition, but not as terrifying as the knowledge that more time has passed between the release of the Tyranid Codex in 1995 and now than between that same Tyranid Codex and the BBC's first airing of Dad's Army. In fact, Dad's Army ran till 1977, which means that when Andy Chambers sat down to write the first codex, he would have looked back on that final episode in the same way you and I look back at seeing Casino Royale or Borat in the cinema. Congratulations! We all got old. If you're wondering why I'm talking so much about Dad's Army, welcome to Oldendemon, the YouTube channel where I gain a perverse kick in placing rose-tinted goggles on your head before knocking them off to the floor and smashing them in front of the rest of the children in the playground. You can think of me as a younger and more nasally sounding Captain Mannering, but in all other ways we are identical.
Here's the health of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Let's turn the clock back to the game that would go on to become Warhammer 40,000, and the big 5 armies that immediately gestated out of it. Space Marines, Imperial Guard, Orcs, Chaos and Elder all dragged themselves out of the primordial sludge of creation that was Rogue Trader, shedding races like the Fimir and Ancient Slan faster than I shed my skin when I revert back to my lizard form. This book was the seed for the first decade of growth behind Warhammer 40,000, but sooner or later the ideas contained within began to dry up. You couldn't feature an entire army of astral hounds, or the concept of enslavers no longer fitted in with the way the universe worked. You had to go somewhere different. So they did. Buried deep in this book, between the Jakero, the orange techno-apes, and the Zotes, lies the first mention of the Tyranids. Their hive fleets are full of millions of crafts, resembling a swarm of cosmic locusts, stripping every world in their path. This description sounds like the Tyranids we know, but then, because it's Rogue Trader, it all gets a bit weird. But first, we're going to up the horror stakes in this video. First, the horrific inevitability of aging, then the terrifying prospect of an interstellar race wanting to eat you, and now the panic you feel in the pit of your stomach when someone you don't know tries to talk to you. Fun fact, when I started this YouTube channel, I got a ton of junk mail. This is because there are organisations out there that scrape the internet to find out all kinds of details about you and then sell this information onwards to marketers who will bombard you with unsolicited junk mail, emails and calls. Luckily, you can remove your details from these websites as long as you contact them directly. However, unluckily, there are hundreds of data brokers operating out there, so doing this by yourself is going to be incredibly time consuming. Fortunately, in the steps today's video partner Incogni, they will contact all these data brokers using some technological magic and digitally strong-arm these individuals into deleting your information. Within a few minutes of setting it up, it had already sent out enough requests to save myself nearly 10 hours of work. That is the equivalent of me edge highlighting an entire Space Marine model. You can get an astonishing 60% off an annual plan using the promo code oldendemon at checkout. Oh, that's funny, I'm getting a call right now from an unknown number. Maybe the requests haven't gone through yet. Hello? Yes? I understand completely. Thank you. That wasn't a marketer, it was my wife. It turns out she wants a divorce. Here's an interesting question for your next pub quiz. Spot the Squig. This picture is the artwork for the 1993 Games Workshop board game Doom of the Elder, and as usual for these densely packed masterpieces, it's got an Easter egg for the discerning viewer. That spider thing that's crawling around the Dire Avenger's legs is a squig. Squigs were always associated with orcs, but in the Tyranid army list in issue 145 of White Dwarf, it was explained that they were canonically bioconstructed by the Tyranids out of orc genetic material sometime in the distant past. The orcs then stormed several Tyranid vessels and took back some of these squigs who still recognised them and made them a part of their orc way of life. However, the Tyranids finally ironed out the remaining squigs' free will, and they became part of the Tyranid swarm. As you can tell, the early first draft of Tyranids was a mixed bag. It's pretty much what would happen if you gave a bunch of creatives magazine space and told them to go wild. You got orc gene stealer hybrids because everyone loved orcs and they were fun, and just why the devil not? You got slave races that cleaned the hive ships. I don't know what they were cleaning the hive ships from, like chocolate bar wrappers, or maybe it gets really dusty inside them, who knows. You got mind slave squads, which appeared to be an excuse to use any other army's unit and say they were infected by a mind slaver, an organism that psychically dominates their brains. You got Zotes, who functioned as Tyranid diplomats who presumably spent the majority of their time trying to explain to new races why the aforementioned mind slave squads weren't a war crime. But all these units still made the Tyranids look like they were too human. They had human needs and desires and still kind of functioned how humans would function if they just started unrestricted genetic manipulation. In the original Rogue Trader rulebooks, the Hive Tyrants who controlled the Tyranid fleets were bloated, filled with eggs, and largely immobile. And if that isn't the coldest diss on the average wargamer's diet, I don't know what is. But from mind slaves to Zotes, none of this stuck. It was still a weird hodgepodge of ideas thrown together to try and form a cohesive army. Reading this article these days is weird and jarring, like that time when the BBC let Joey from Friends host Top Gear. But Games Workshop did have one good idea that really resonated, or more specifically, someone else had a good idea that they liberally borrowed from, the Alien franchise. I don't think we can really talk about Tyranid history without pointing the connection between them and the Alien film franchise. Alien came out in 1979 and Aliens was released in 1986. A year later, in 1987's Rogue Trader, we got the first appearance of the Yumgal gene stealer, I'm probably mispronouncing that, which looked and sounded like the xenomorph, but with a tentacled head. It even had a chest-bursting reproductive cycle. They were featured in Games Workshop's first edition of Space Hulk 3 years later in 1989, then in 1990's Space Crusade and Advanced Space Crusade, minus the tentacles, which were presumably too hard to sculpt. But by this time, both the Gene Stealers and the Space Marines they were fighting against had been almost totally redesigned from their Rogue Trader origins. No longer were they kind of aliens fighting against kind of colonial Marines. Both races had been fleshed out, pun intended. The chest-bursting part of their background was written out. Instead, the Gene Stealers just infect the host, altering its genetic makeup and turning the unfortunate victim into a Gene Stealer hybrid instead. By 1992, the Alien franchise was creatively in the toilet, but commercially still viable. However, the Gene Stealers had been lumped together with the Tyranids, and a year later, in 1993, came Tyranid Attack, in which the Gene Stealers and their cultists were teaming up with Tyranid warriors to battle Space Marine scouts. Also that year came a favourite of this channel, 2nd edition Warhammer 40,000. Trying to piece together the history of all these different designs reveals that it's basically just a bunch of people using each other as influences. In 1993 there came the Hormagaunts, which absolutely looked like a xenomorph with its elongated head. In 1997 we had the movie for Starship Troopers, but the idea of bugs in space started with the book in 1959. Star StarCraft the game came out in 1998, complete with the Zerg, a Tyranid adjacent race, but then you have the Tyranid Ravener model, which came out in 2001, but looked very similar to the StarCraft Hydralisk. Meanwhile, by this point, the Hormagaunts had ditched their alien-inspired design and just looked more like the stabby versions of the Termagants. Ultimately, Bugs in Space is a fairly large canvas in which to use for the antagonists in your sci-fi setting. The owners of all these franchises have all changed hands, so when you discuss this online, it's important to just pick a company you dislike most and call them hack frauds. If my waiter ever offers me Pepsi rather than Coke, I take the drink and then pour it straight onto the floor while staring them in the eyes to let them know my displeasure. Remember, you have to pick a side in this discussion. Always. Just heap on the vitriol. Please, do it now. Scream your anger in the comments section. By the fires of Zeus, these people must bear witness to your anger. Or don't really. It's up to you either way. Please subscribe. Skipping to 1993, we come to 2nd edition Warhammer 40,000. This was a juggernaut that properly kickstarted the franchise. If you played Space Hulk, Space Crusade, or one of the other assorted board games of that time, you already had a bunch of Space Marines, along with some Gene Stealers and Tyranid warriors. The trouble was that when 2nd edition 40k was released, the Space Marines were pretty much a fully realised army, while the entire Tyranid army list could barely cover a full page. Games Workshop had to repurpose the idea of a hive tyrant to give Tyranid players some form of leader and psychic user so they wouldn't break their new army building rules and mission cards. The Tyranids were in a bit of a limbo. However, all would change when Andy the Hare Chambers came to reformat them for the prime time. He birthed the twin masterpieces of Hive War, a supplement for Epic, and the first ever Tyranid Codex for Warhammer 40,000. Hive War came first, and the Tyranids' plastic infantry sprue contained gargoyles, lictors, hormagaunts, as well as tiny versions of the existing Gene Stealers, Termagaunts, and Tyranid warriors. Meanwhile, the classic Carnifex was given a metal sculpt and backed up with brand new creatures including Zonothropes, Trigons, Exocrines, Malefactors, Harrispexes, Harridans, and of course, their newly reimagined overlords, the Hive Tyrants. As you can see, a lot of weird stuff got cast up, and the larger models didn't survive their first visual incarnations. In fact, some of these, the Dactylis and the Dominatrix, have been lost to the sands of time. To be honest, putting the scale issues to one side, selling something called a Tyranid Dominatrix might be a stretch these days. It would certainly conflict with one of my favourite Google searches. But Andy Chambers nailed the tricky idea of exactly how to explain an alien race that is completely different from human society. You do that by telling the story of the Tyranids from the perspective of the victims of the Tyranids. Hive War talks about the first and second Tyrannic wars, the first being the discovery of the Tyranids on Tyran and the attack on Ultramar by Hive Fleet Behemoth. Meanwhile, the second Tyrannic war was the attack on Craftworld Aandon by Hive Fleet Kraken. I'm just going to point out that the oh-so-clever games designers named the last planet before Macragga Pyrandium, which means lunch in Latin, not to be confused with the word Pyreneum, which means something completely different. Meanwhile, the Tyranid Codex focuses on the battle on Tyran and the Polar Fortress on Macragga and its subsequent defence by the First Company of Ultramarines, and the attack on Icar 4 by Kraken, which turned into a global campaign featured in White Dwarf magazine. It also features sub-references like the Scythes of the Emperor, then known as the Scythes, battling them on Myral Prime, and a company of Lamenters being wiped out at Devlin. This was the birth of the modern Tyranids as we know today. No longer were they egg-eating fatties, they had an element of proper horror to them. But such was the radical nature of change, the 2nd edition rule set needed completely overhauling. 2nd edition was a quaint game of skirmish combat, blowing up bunkers and sabotaging the enemy's ammo dumps, and the Tyranids did none of that. In order to incorporate this vision of a wholly alien race, and the chambers disemboweled the core of 2nd edition rules in the same way that I would disembowel a fresh bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And this was no small feat. At this point, he must have been working harder than Elon Musk's therapist. The Codex changed the shooting phase. Firing into units and firing into close combats was now a thing. It changed the way certain weapons interacted with them. War gear was out. Obviously, field saves and vortex grenades were out of their reach. The rules on victory points and psychic powers got rewritten. The missions got changed. The strategy cards got thrown in the bin, malfunction and traitor either not being thematically or mechanically viable against them. The Tyranids instead got a special event table to roll on for each enemy unit that opposed them. The classic result was called Jones is acting strangely. This rule meant that you rolled a d6 at the start of each Tyranid turn, and if you roll a 6, a random model in the squad is instantly killed as a Tyranid parasite explodes from their body. The best part of this rule is that in the way that it's written, the effects don't stop once the first person explodes. You appear to keep rolling, turning the entire squad into a living bomb throughout the game. Jones really was acting quite strangely. But like the creature exploding from the chest of John Hurt, the Tyranids needed one last detail of their arrival. Their first victim, a battle report in White Dwarf called the Great Devourer, where a new Tyranid army freshly painted from the heavy metal team faced off against a combined Imperial Guard and Elder force. The scenario involved an endlessly respawning Tyranid force having to totally wipe out their opponents within 6 turns, which thanks to a clever bit of positioning and some lucky psychic powers, they managed without too much difficulty. Inevitably, the stitches holding the main Warhammer 40,000 rules together couldn't last forever, and when 3rd edition arrived in 1998, it was time to abandon the hyper-saturated design of the 2nd edition armies and the walls of vehicle datasheets and quaint humour, and focus completely on the grimdark nature of the 41st millennium. The larger armies of this time meant that Tyranids needed multi-part plastic kits for the Gaunts and Tyranid warriors, and a huge redesign for a load of models. This was due to the 3rd edition Tyranid Codex, meaning that each model and creature could be totally modular. It meant redesigning the Hive Tyrant and the Carnifex so they could incorporate the vast amount of new bioweapons they could use. Plus, they received special unique characters. The Red Terror, who originated on Devlan, presumably responsible for wiping out that company of Lamenters from before, and Old One-Eye, who was found beneath the ice on Calth during the assault on Macragga by High Fleet Behemoth. Old One-Eye is presumably a take on an idea from the previous edition where you could give a creature the ability to regenerate wounds it took every turn, bringing it back from death almost endlessly. And while this was a time in which the codexes were really small books, the background of the Tyranids was now locked in place and just needed to be expanded on. Over the next couple of decades, it was. Eventually, all the older metal sculpts were remade in plastic kits, along with a giant Trigon and a multi-part plastic Hive Tyrant kit that allowed you to assemble the Swarmlord, a creature that was said to have been involved in the first 2 Tyrannic wars. But in the last decade or so, there has been an idea that the Tyranids aren't so much as driven to consume everything that stands in their way, as much as they are fleeing some gigantic outer threat. It's a great idea. There are rumours and allusions to threats from beyond the galaxy. However, in modern Warhammer 40,000, this mystery seems to have been solved once and for all. 10,000 years before the current time frame, during the Horus Heresy, something known as the Pharos device was discovered on the planet Slotha at the heart of Ultramar. This device was very similar to the Astronomicon on Earth, the giant psychic lighthouse fueled by human sacrifice that allows warp travel between planets. This device was overloaded in an attempt to destroy it, and in the process set off a massive beacon into space. In the darkness, something of limitless hunger stirred in a slumber that had lasted for aeons. A million frozen and unblinking eyes saw the flash, tripping cascades of stimuli. Their purpose served, the eyes died. Slowly, glacially, the Great Devourer shifted its course. This is why the First and Second Tyrannic Wars happened. The poor sizes of the Emperor were assigned to guard over the planet Slotha and ended up getting largely consumed by Hive Fleet Kraken. And once the Tyranids entered into the galaxy, they appear to have caught wind of the Astronomicon's beacon, and that's why there is a giant Tyranid fleet, Hive Fleet Leviathan, coming up from below the galactic plane straight towards Earth. That is what you are fighting in Space Marine 2. If only the Imperium had used Incogni to remove their details from data brokers' websites. Use the promo code oldendemon at checkout to get 60% off a year's plan. Haha! You thought you'd skip the advert bit, but I brought it right back. You're probably wondering if you should skip this bit as well. I can see your finger on the button. Well, I've got news for you, pal. The internet is just adverts all the way down. There truly is no escape. So, what does the future hold for the Tyranids? In recent years, we've seen the Neurotyrant, the Psychophage, and the Norn Assimilator, amongst others, added into this range. I've listed a few picks from least likely to most likely to get plastic releases before they turn the galaxy into a lifeless husk and move on to find food elsewhere. It's unlikely that we will ever see a Tyranid dominatrix again. The scale and the name makes it very tricky to do. Likewise, the Norn Queens are talked about, but they are spacebound creatures, so unless we see a version of Battlefleet Gothic down the line, complete with the miniatures to make up a high fleet, it's unlikely. The Dimitron, I've almost certainly pronounced that wrong, is a Forge World model that recently went out of production. Although, considering this fulfills the same purpose as the Norn Emissary, it's unlikely we'll see it returning. The Meotic Spore, again, no idea about the pronouncement, is a bit of a weird one. It's not the sexiest model to collect and use, just being a giant floating bomb. The Melanthrope is probably too niche, and again just a bit of a pain to balance on wobbly tables. The Harridan and the Hierophant Titan are both probably too large and fragile for the tabletop, even in plastic, as opposed to resin. Maybe if we get a proper re-release of Epic 40,000 we might see them, but I guess that's a long way off. Having said that, they have just been announced for Space Marine 2 the game, so a lot of these might just turn up there in future. The Sky Slashers and Tyranid Shrikes are a good bet. Basically, winged rippers and winged Tyranid warriors. I can see this being a great kill team set to slide into a 2-player box somewhere. Stick in some alternate sculpt gargoyles and you're pretty much sorted. The Malefactor, a kind of Tyranid transport from Epic, which house creatures inside it, could make a comeback. Although Tyranids have evolved, pun intended, please subscribe, not to use transport vehicles, so it might remain unseen forevermore. From even further afield, we could see something like the Nautiloid from the old Warhammer 40,000 collectible card game, as well as the Viragon. Both of these have fairly distinctive looking models and would be pretty spectacular looking kits if they ever reached production. But if I had to place my money on a kit returning in the next few years, it would probably be, drumroll, a Herodule Biotitan. These were a pair of old Forge World resin kits. One had multiple claws and the other was dual wielding a pair of barbed stranglers. This would be an ideal Tyranid super heavy vehicle sized creature, the perfect size and shape to be leading a brood of Carnifexes into battle. And on that note, I'm off to buy a value pack of Raid just in case. Subscribe for more content and I'll see you next time.